Welcome back to the Christian Mysticism Podcast, where we explore the fascinating history of Christian mysticism from the early days of the Church until today. I'm Alberto de la Cruz, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Carlos Eyre, the T. Lawson Riggs Professor of History and Religious Studies at Yale University. Glad to have you back on, Carlos.
Well, glad to be here with you. It's been a while.
I know. I kind of miss our more frequent talks, but schedules are schedules and life is life. Well, on this episode, we're going to be talking about two different spiritual realms, the supernatural and the satanical. Tell us about it.
Yes. Well, every great mystic that I've read, anyway, there might be some I haven't read who don't talk about the devil, but most of them actually do, because it's part of the journey to holiness and part of the journey to crossing the line between what we experience with our senses in this world and what there is that is unseen. So in the Christian mystical tradition, the devil is always there, and always there trying to stop the progress that anyone is making and to drag them down as much as possible. So there are encounters constantly in mystical texts. We read of encounters between the mystic and the demonic. Now, there is a huge difference, however, between encounters with the devil and demonic possession, which is sometimes a phenomenon that brushes against mystics, and they have to deal with it. Not so much their own possession, themselves being possessed, but having to deal with other people who are. And that is our topic for today, is what the intersection is between demonic possession, exorcism, and the Christian mystical tradition. And we'll be covering Protestant as well as Catholic, but mostly Catholic because the mystics, most of them are Catholics. But there's much that, because there's so many films nowadays about possession and exorcism, there are a lot of misconceptions about what it is. And of course, anyone who has read the New Testament knows from reading the Gospels and also the Acts of the Apostles and in the epistles too, the subject of demonic possession comes up. In the Gospels, it comes up frequently. Jesus, in his public ministry, spends a considerable amount of time in the Gospels dealing with possessed individuals and expelling the demons from them. So it's there from the very beginning of the Christian religion. Although interestingly enough, there are no possession accounts in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures. But it's quite obvious that sometime between the 6th, 7th century before Christ and the time of Christ, some Jews came to believe in the reality of demonic possession, and they dealt with individuals who claimed to be possessed. But of course, not all Jews believed in this, because the difference between the Pharisees and Sadducees was that the Pharisees did believe in spiritual beings, like angels and demons, but the Sadducees did not. But Jesus, in walking around ancient Palestine, kept encountering possessed people constantly.
I wanted to say something about that because demonic possession, as you said, it's something that you really see in the New Testament. You don't see it in the Old Testament, but obviously before the New Testament was written, there was demonic possession. You read accounts of it all over the Gospels. So obviously it wasn't something that started with Christianity.
Oh, I was there from way, way back. As a matter of fact, I just read an article about, and it's a new book that's been published on ghosts in ancient Babylonia. And one of the facts mentioned in this book just floored me, because, in ancient Babylonia, they wrote on clay tablets, and they used these marks known as cuneiform instead of an alphabet. And we have thousands upon thousands of clay tablets that have survived. As a matter of fact, here at Yale, we have a whole collection of Babylonian clay tablets. But the author of this book, which is on ghosts, claims that about 1/3 of all of the clay tablets that he has encountered deal with ghosts. And back, we're talking 3,500 years before Christ, in ancient Babylonia, people could be possessed by the spirits of dead humans. And as a matter of fact, often were. So we're talking about possession in 3,500 before Christ. So the neighbors of the Jews were all dealing with possessions. And all of the religions, pagan religions, non-Jewish religions, there was some kind of possession. And some believed in demons and some did not. Some of these religions and some of these cultures did not. So whether you were possessed by a ghost or a demon, you're still talking about the same phenomenon. Someone else has taken over you. So sometime before the birth of Christ, demonic possession became a belief among the ancient Jews. And if you're trying to trace the history of demonic possession in the Christian religion, it's an unbroken line. And so many of the early church fathers mention it, talk about it. You can find it in Justin Martyr, Minucius Felix, Origen, Tertullian. And we're still dealing with the 2nd and 3rd century here. And they describe how the Christian community dealt with these possessed people. And it involved prayer, it involved the laying on of hands, and also involved sometimes using relics of the saints. But the most important element in the prayers was always Jesus, the Savior. And the demons were commanded to come out of the person because Jesus was there and in charge. Actually, the term exorcism comes from the Greek and Latin, pretty much the same. Calling out is what the exorcism is all about. It's an adjuration, a command to do what? A command to come out. And the command is made in the name of Jesus.
Now, we use the term demonic possession, but it's a general term. There's different types of demonic manifestations.
Yes. The terminology became more precise, more refined as time passed. And there are different degrees of demonic presence. Possession, strictly speaking, is when a demon, or plural, demons, several of them, take over a person's body and mind. Slightly less troublesome is obsession. And in obsession, the person is not losing their body to the demon. The obsession is mental and spiritual. It's called obsession because it's the person who's constantly surrounded by demons who are having an effect or an impact on this person with temptations of all sorts, but especially, mental, psychological, spiritual assault, basically mental torture. And then it's not only people who can be surrounded by demons, buildings can also be infested by demons. And that's the technical term, an infestation. We tend to speak of infestation as applying to insects, right? Oh, my house is infested with carpenter ants. No, but in the Christian tradition and Christian history, an infestation is an infestation of a place. It could be a dwelling, it could be somebody's house, but it could also be a location that is infested with demons. The early desert fathers, the desert hermits that we've spoken about before, they thought the desert was full of demons. And actually, when they were going out there, like St. Anthony, whom we've spoken about, he was out there battling demons constantly because the demons lived in the air, in the desert, and they liked desert places. But there's no doubt that urban Christians in Egypt and everywhere also were all very worried about the presence of demons. And we have this quip from the Emperor Julian, known as Julian the Apostate, because he was baptized, but then renounced his Christianity. Julian, who didn't like Christians, said the following. It's kind of a descriptive narrative. It says, yes, you can always tell who the Christians are out on the street because they are constantly making the sign of the cross on themselves and hissing at demons. Of course, he didn't mean that as a compliment, and it's probably an exaggeration. But yes, the sign of the cross, which is ancient in the Christian tradition, that one makes on one's body, is like you're putting a protective shield around yourself, because demons hate the cross. They hate Jesus, and they hate also the relics of the saints.
I just watched Ghostbusters, the original, not that long ago, after many, many years of having not seen it. And, you mentioned the infestation. I couldn't help but remembering the plot of that movie.
Yes, yeah.
The demons all coming to New York, to that one building.
That's right. The building was like a entry point.
Exactly.
For these evil deities.
And their business took off because there was an infestation.
In New York, yes. I remember that. That movie is 40 years old. It's one of my favorites. And Ghostbusters 2 is also excellent and continues the story of the infestation.
Yeah, those are great movies. So tell us, what is the inherent connection between mysticism and the demonic?
Well, the inherent connection is the crossing over, you see. And there's one line in the creed that Catholics recite in church. Protestants do too, the same one. I believe in one God, Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and of all things visible and invisible. That distinction inserted into the creed is like a huge red flag for me. A red flag that points to the fact that Christian belief is about a whole unseen dimension. And that's the dimension that mystics enter, and which they try to describe, and they're always saying, I can only describe it ineptly. But when you cross over, you not only have good angels, you have bad angels. You not only have God, but you also have those fallen angels who, for some mysterious reason, this is a very troublesome point in Christian theology. Everything they do it against God, but the only reason they can do it is that God is allowing them to do all this. That God is somehow, for some reason that only God knows for sure, he's allowing them to continue to use their free will to resist him, to work evil in the world. And it is one of the most troublesome points in Christian theology. Technical term for it is theodicy. That's the term. Theology of evil. Why evil exists, why God permits evil. But obviously all these holy people who are struggling to become holier and get closer to God, the devil is always, like resisting them. Their efforts trying to derail them. It's part of the journey. And, it is so much a part of the journey that it refers to the fact that mysteriously God sometimes employs the devil's free will to strengthen holy people. Pretty much like, let's use a very crude analogy. You build up muscle by lifting weights. What is weightlifting? It's resistance, right? You're encountering resistance from gravity to lift things up. And if you do it often enough, regularly enough, and even scientifically enough, you become stronger and stronger and stronger. And that metaphor, not of weightlifting, but the metaphor of demonic influence making people holier. It's almost like God is playing a joke on the devil, allowing the devil to resist God and resist the people who are trying to be holy. Actually, only it ends up working against the devil. And it's not uncommon also in Christian history for this struggle to be taking place in monasteries, where people dedicate or try to dedicate their lives completely to the divine. So monasteries and convents are flashpoints of this struggle. But possession is different in that possession is something that is usually in some shape, way, or form blamed on the behavior of the person who ends up being possessed. So there's this great distinction made between holy people and mystics who resist the devil, and it's painful. It's awful. But they're resisting. The possessed are people who have done something wrong in their lives and opened themselves up to demonic influence. Or later in the Middle Ages, this other interpretation surfaces that witchcraft is involved, and a sorcerer or witch can command demons to possess people. And we'll get back to that before we're done talking today, because this is something that becomes especially troublesome in the 17th century. This idea that a sorcerer or witch can send the devil into people. To give an example of what happens, because, the literature on exorcism and demonic possession is vast, and it includes a lot of contemporary literature. If you just look on Amazon.com for books on exorcism, possession, or another term used in some Protestant churches is spirit deliverance, the number of books you will find is just astonishing. And of course, the Catholic Church still practices exorcism, and the ritual being used now by the Catholic Church was established in 1619. It's had a few changes made. The two most recent changes in 1999 and 2013. A little tiny bit was changed, but the ritual that is followed is still pretty much continuity with the 1619 Rituale Romanum and what preceded it too. But let's say that, 2024, someone believes that a member of the household is possessed or obsessed, or that the house is infested with demons. The very first set of questions that they will be asked will be, have you visited a psychic lately? Have you had your palm read? Have you had tarot cards read for you? Have you played with a Ouija board? And so on. These are ways that people open themselves up, according to the Catholic teaching on exorcism and demonic possession or infestations. And quite often, of course, some link is established between the person's behavior and the intense presence of the demonic in their midst. And I should point out, too, this is also part of the beginning of any investigation, is in the case of possession or obsession, especially, distinguishing between psychological problems and genuine possession or obsession. Because from medieval times onwards, this is all part of the exorcism ritual. And the first thing is you determine whether this person is sane or not. And quite often, those who claim that they're possessed are told, no, you're not. You need psychiatric help. And that continues to happen to this day.
Let's talk a little about some of the things that are used, because I'm sure it's happening with me and it's happening to our listeners as they listen to this, and they're probably going back and remembering scenes from The Exorcist. What are the roles of, and you mentioned earlier, relics and the sign of the cross, but for those of us who have seen The Exorcist, you remember the cross and holy water. What
Yes.
are the roles of those items?
Well, this is a crossing over from the spiritual dimension to the material dimension. The problem becomes a material problem, whether we're talking about possession, obsession, or infestation. It's a material problem. So, and this is where Catholics differ from Protestants in their approach to possession, because Catholicism not only has sacraments, and these are rituals that are usually rites of passage, marriage, baptism, the last rites are sacraments. But there are also sacraments that are not for rites of passage, like the Eucharist or penance, where you confess your sins and you're forgiven. And these are repeated. The rites of passage sacraments are, once in a lifetime, usually. But there are sacraments that keep being repeated. But the Catholic Church also has sacramentals, is the official term. These are material substances that have spiritual power. So we're talking about a material substance that, because the church has power over the spiritual realm, these material substances carry genuine divine spiritual power in them. And these are holy water, sacred salt, and of course oil. And we don't read about holy water or sacred salt in the New Testament, but we certainly read about anointing with oil, right? It's a way of providing a material connection to a spiritual dimension, which is what sacraments do too. So, the Eucharist is all about crossing over to the divine dimension, ingesting the body and blood of Christ. So, what is holy water? Holy water is water that in various ways has been made free of demonic presence by the church. How does that happen? Well, there are prayers for turning water, normal, everyday water, into holy water. Holy water can be found in the sacristy or should be there in the sacristy of every Catholic church, big tank full of water that you can take home with you. Bring the holy water home. So through prayers, water can be exorcised, can be made free of demons, and also by cleaning the sacred vessels of the Eucharist. Sacred salt, through prayers, same thing. You can make salt free of demonic presences and supercharged with divine presence. Sacred salt lasts a lot longer. It's more efficacious in terms of longevity than holy water, which, evaporates. And holy oil is used for the last rites, and also now is more commonly used when people are seriously ill, the anointing of the sick. But it's really holy water, sacred salt. And the crucifix or the cross, the devil hates them with a passion. And in Teresa of Avila's autobiography, she describes all of these demonic attacks that she endures. And she says, I'm not afraid of the devil at all. All I need to do is sprinkle holy water. And then she says explicitly, why does holy water work so well? She asks rhetorically. She says, it's because it has the church's power in it. And the devil hates that. And the devil can't stand it when you sprinkle holy water around it. So we see some of that in all these exorcism movies as well as vampire movies. But the fact is that in the Catholic tradition, you have a material substance used to address the problem of evil spiritual presence coming into material substances, be it a human body or a building. Many mystics, in their struggles against demons, constantly express how, if you're really on the right track, you will suffer these attacks. As a matter of fact, the attacks are a sign that you are on the right track because it angers the devil. But that ultimately, if you are on the right track too, you will have no need to fear the devil, no matter what horrible things are happening to you, because ultimately the devil always loses if you're on the right track. If you're giving your will over completely to God, you will always vanquish the devil.
In other words, if you're not getting attacked, you're not doing it right.
That's right. That's right. And in this respect, this comes from the monastic tradition. Martin Luther repeated that over and over again, many times, as advice to people. Rejoice if you're being attacked, because that means you're doing something right.
It means you're over the target. Tell us a little bit about Saint Benedict.
Well, Saint Benedict, the father of Western monasticism, his rule for monasteries, which became the most widely used rule in Western Christianity, and is still being used by many monasteries, is all about obedience to God, about turning your will over to God, and how to do that best as a community of people who are communally seeking the divine. So the devil, of course, always plays a role in trying to put up obstacles, people being truly obedient, giving their wills over to God. Throughout the Middle Ages, precisely because, monks became such experts at dealing with the devil, this devotion arose surrounding the person of Saint Benedict as being a very powerful advocate against the devil. And, talk about material substances. And, here's again, a major difference between Protestants and Catholics on this. Catholics wear religious images around their neck or put them in their pockets. They carry religious images with them. The image of Saint Benedict evolved into a very specific kind of religious object or medal that has an image of Saint Benedict holding the rule for monasteries in one hand and a cross in the other. And then it's covered with acronyms on the front and back, letters. And I won't read the letters, but if you ever encounter one of these St. Benedict medals, on the back, it has a cross and acronyms, letters that stand for phrases. In the front, it also has letters that stand for phrases. On the front, it says, "The Holy Cross be my light. May the dragon never be my guide." Notice the devil is being called a dragon. "Crux sacra sit mihi lux. Nunquam draco sit mihi dux." There's an acronym for that in Latin. On the back, it says, "Go away, Satan. Vade retro, Satana. Vade retro. Numquam suade mihi vana sunt mala quae libas. Ipse venena bibas." It's very, very funny, because what that means is, get behind me, Satan. Vade retro. Don't persuade me with these vain things. Whatever you're offering is evil. That very same evil thing, drink deeply of it. Ipse venena bibas. So, St. Benedict medal is kind of like, again, a protective shield. I was reading up on this medal, and of course there are many devotional practices that people carry out that are not necessarily supported by the Catholic Church, but people do it anyway. And one of these is that if you place St. Benedict medals in the corners of your house will be protected. And you can even go further. You can put St. Benedict medals at each corner of your property, and that protects your entire property. But those are the kinds of practices that are common in some cultures, but good luck finding any official approval from the Catholic Church about these things.
Well, I guess you could always say it doesn't hurt.
That's right. It doesn't. And, it's a very human thing, and it predates Christianity. It's part of most religions, major world religions as well as tribal religions. People want to have some material point of contact with the divine. And I'm reminded of this, that even in very Protestant Geneva under John Calvin, we're talking 16th century, right? All of this stuff was forbidden. Carrying around religious medals? No. Well, they had a special court in Geneva called the consistory that brought in anyone who was doing something wrong with their behavior or with religion. And I remember reading that they had various cases, actually a good number of them, of people who were brought before the consistory for the sin of cutting up little sections out of a page of the Bible and wearing that around their necks. So it's protection. The technical term used in the study of religion is a talisman. But Teresa of Avila swore by holy water and by the cross and crucifix. Very, very powerful.
So let's talk a little bit about the experiences that mystics over the centuries have had with exorcisms and battling demons.
There are numerous stories in hagiographies. Not all saints perform exorcisms, but some do. For instance, Saint Benedict, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, another person that we've dealt with, Saint Ignatius Loyola. Actually, there's a very famous painting by a Dutch artist that shows Ignatius Loyola exorcising a possessed person. And, you asked about relics before. St. Ignatius was a mystic. I think everyone agrees on this. He's one of those rare mystics. I think they're relatively rare who actually engage in exorcisms. There's a story from 17th century Poland And in Poland, by the 17th century, most of the nobility had converted to Calvinist Protestantism. Well, a Calvinist woman became possessed, and the Calvinist clergy were unable to rid her of the demons. So even though they were Protestants, they called on Jesuits to come and perform the exorcism. And the Jesuit, of course, brought a relic, a bone of St. Ignatius. And when he placed that bone on the possessed person started to writhe and scream and do all these things that possessed people tend to do. But one of the strangest cases of a mystic engaging in exorcisms and then becoming obsessed himself is from the 17th century too. And something weird happening in the 17th century, especially in France, where there are many possessions throughout France of individuals, but there are also several convents where all of the nuns become possessed by the devil. And the most famous of these cases was the convent at Loudun, France, where all of the nuns became possessed. And many exorcists flocked to this place, try to get it. So many nuns are possessed, you need more than one exorcist. But one of these exorcists was a Jesuit, John Joseph Surin. And Surin is a mystic who actually, they speak of schools of mysticism. He actually gathered quite a following. And there's a school of, Surin disciples in France. But Surin, in exorcising the nuns, and especially in dealing with their superior, struck a deal, and this is highly unusual, having a very difficult time getting rid of the devils in these nuns, and made a bargain with the devil. Okay, take me instead, which is actually the ending of the original movie The Exorcist from the 1970s, where the exorcist and then ends up taking the demon himself. But then in the movie, he just throws himself out the window, I think is how it ends. But what happened to Surin is that he successfully exorcised the demons at Loudun, and then for more than a decade afterwards, he was obsessed by demons. And we're talking about like seriously obsessed, physically affected, to the point that he could barely function. But there was something very strange that would happen with Surin, which is that any time he said Mass, he was fine. And whenever he went to preach, his sermons were great, wonderful. I have a little text here from Surin, because he wrote a lot about his own experience with the devil. And here's a passage. For 3.5 months, and he writes this in a letter, for 3.5 months I have never been without a devil at my side as I am performing my duties. Things have gotten to the point where God has allowed, I believe, because of my sins, something that perhaps has never been seen in the church, that in the exercise of my ministry, the devil passes from the body of the possessed person and, coming into mine, assaults me, knocks me over backward, and agitates and tortures me visibly, possessing me for several hours like an energumen, or spirit or ghost. I cannot explain to you what happens in me during this time, and how that spirit unites itself with mine without depriving me either of my senses or my freedom, and becoming nevertheless as another myself, as if I had two souls, one of which is dispossessed of its body and the use of its organs, and stands aside watching the doings of the one that has entered it. These two spirits do battle with each other in the same field that is the body, and the soul itself is as if divided, and, by a part of itself, subject of diabolical impressions, and by the other, the subject of movements that are its own or that God gives it. So there's that crossing over, right? And there's the intersection. There is no other case that I know of as strong an intersection of the divine and demonic as the case of Father Surin, who offered himself up basically as an exchange for the freedom of the nuns. So at this point, before we run out of time, I think I need to mention that in the case of Father Surin, he speaks about his body being taken over and losing control of his body. One way the surest way that exorcists determine whether there is a genuine possession is that the genuinely possessed person will always manifest movements, really weird movements that are not normal. All sorts of writhing, sticking out their tongues, saying the most horrible things possible. Always, in addition, being able to read the mind of the exorcist and kind of like blurt out the exorcist's worst sins to everyone in the room. Another weird one is being able to understand languages they have never studied, especially ancient languages hardly anybody knows. And these nuns at Loudun, these exorcisms went on for several years, and they were very public. And people came to see the nuns writhing on stage and doing really weird things with their bodies. And I should add that levitation is another manifestation of possession. And in that respect, Catholics and Protestants agree. Right? There are descriptions of the nuns at Loudun levitating that are identical to descriptions of possessed Protestant individuals levitating. So things get weird, and it's one of these aspects of the spiritual life and the mystical path that if you look at it one way, you say, well, this is too weird. This is too strange. This is too disturbing. But if you look at it, change your perspective a bit and think that there is, in fact, so much evil in the world, and human beings can do such evil things that seem contrary to human reason, that this weirdness should be expected. It might have become less common now than it was, let's say, in the 17th century, but it's still out there. I would recommend all our listeners, if they're curious or if they're having trouble digesting this information, there is an exorcist who died in 2016. His name was Gabriele Amort. He was the exorcist of the Diocese of Rome. And in his lifetime, he exorcised over 60,000 people. And he has written several books. But the book I would like to recommend is the one that made the biggest splash. The title of it in English is An Exorcist Tells His Story. And at that time, this book came out in English in the 1990s. At that time, he was complaining in this book that there weren't enough exorcists in the Catholic Church. And especially in Rome and in Italy, there weren't enough exorcists to handle all of the possessed people. His book helped to correct that. He managed to increase the number of exorcists, not just in Rome, but in Italy and throughout the Catholic world, just because he publicized this phenomenon. And his book is not only filled with narratives of weird things, but it's also very logical explanation or logical arguing for this being a continuity of the Christian experience that can be traced back to the New Testament, and that it's not going to go away. As a matter of fact, and his viewpoint is that it's gotten worse, and that the 20th century is far worse when it comes to this phenomenon than the 17th.
I have often wondered if this perception that demonic possession and demonic influence is not as prevalent today as it was in the early days of the church or in the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, if it's truly not as prevalent, or have we just found other excuses for it?
It's very easy to pathologize these phenomena, right? It's very easy to jump to the conclusion that, this is really a psychological problem, or physiological and psychological problem that makes this person writhe this way and do these weird things. However, where it crosses over into the truly otherworldly is when you have these other manifestations like, understanding ancient languages and levitating and so on. But if you read Amort, you can come away after reading his book, An Exorcist Tells His Story. You can come away realizing that there are a lot of these weird events that never make it, never become public knowledge, and they're not reported on, and that they are far more frequent than anyone might assume.
Even if you go outside of these phenomena of understanding languages or reading people's minds just go down to the pure evil of it. An individual carrying out a mass shooting and killing dozens of people. You read about it, and they'll talk about his upbringing and his childhood and what they went through and what led to them committing this atrocious act. But for me, at least, it's hard to believe something so evil can take place without the evil one, Satan himself, playing a role in it.
And Father Amort would agree with you on that. That in fact, one of the consequences of the Western world abandoning not just the Christian religion, but abandoning belief in God, which has its, the flip side of that coin is if you don't believe in God, of course you're not going to believe in the devil either. And Western culture now is divided in very unusual configuration. There are Christians who believe in God and believe in the devil. There are Christians who believe only in God and think the devil is not real. And then you've got people who don't believe in God or the devil. But one of the consequences of this, according to Father Amort, is look at our history. Look at the history of the Western world in the 20th century and all of these horrors. And we're talking only about the formerly Christian world, right? You think of all of the horrors of the First World War, the Second World War in Europe, the Holocaust, and you look at the alternative religion created by the Nazis and the alternative religion created by the communists in the Soviet Union, then all this other weird stuff that keeps happening. Amort says, well, this is proof. Things are worse now than they were in the 17th century. You sometimes have to wonder. And I have to say, I'll add this to our discussion, is that whereas I don't personally know any mystics, I have never encountered one that I know, right? But I do know someone who had their house exorcised because of an infestation, and I was witness to it. So perhaps that it might be an indication that these things are far more common than one would expect. And I'll add this little detail to it. The priest who came to do the exorcism was trembling. He explained that he hadn't done this very often. He was really scared. I've seen this with my own eyes. From an outsider's perspective, I was there. I saw this happening. I heard the stories told to me by those who had asked for the exorcism. It seemed very real to me.
Well, for those of us who are Christian, none of this should be a surprise. St. Paul wrote in his letter to the Ephesians, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." So we were warned that this is not just flesh and blood. This is not just the material world that we're going up against. We're going up against evil forces.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point, because you do find this warning in the New Testament throughout all of its individual texts. There's also, I think it's 2 Peter, where he says, be on your guard, because the devil is always around you trying to devour you like a roaring lion. So be careful, watch out.
We also take consolation in the fact that the war and the battle has already been won. So as St. Padre Pio said, and we talked about in our last episode, there's nothing to fear. There's nothing to be afraid of. That's
right. And that was also, I still remember one of the very first things that St. John Paul II said. Fear not. You have no reason to fear. Do not fear. And that's what all the great saints have always said. And I'm reminded of the story from the life of St. Anthony. We talked about this, but to sort of remind people of when St. Anthony in the desert was being tormented by demons and actually being physically assaulted by them. He kept praying, and he didn't think he was getting any help. And finally, there's one sort of breakthrough moment where Christ appeared to him. And Anthony's response was, "Finally, where have you been?" And Jesus Christ says to him, "I was here all the time. I was here." just wanted to make sure that you could own this. Basically, that's not the exact translation, but you could claim this, that you could do it. The test. I've always interpreted that passage in my classes. I say, yeah, Jesus is like a coach, pushes people to the limit so that they can become aware of the fact that they have the capability of doing incredible things.
Well, I'm glad we did this episode because since we started, we've been talking about the connection between the material world and the spiritual world, but the spiritual world is not just God and angels. It's also very evil demons and a devil that wants to destroy us. And if he can't destroy us, wants to make our life as miserable as possible. So I'm glad we did this episode, and it could be a little scary.
Oh, it's very scary. It's very scary. I'll have this final anecdote. I just remembered it. When that first Exorcist movie came out in the 1970s, I lived in a house that was 2 different apartments. I lived upstairs. My downstairs neighbor was a single woman who went to see The Exorcist one night, and she came back so scared. She knocked on my door and asked me to come down and search through her house. I had to look under her bed to make sure everything was okay. And she was not a very deeply religious person, but this is something that strikes a chord in people, I think, and the fear immediately rises when you think about these things.
Well, I was a little kid when The Exorcist came out, so my parents didn't take me to the movies to go see it, but my older siblings did see it. It terrified them. I ended up seeing it later in my early teens, and I could say there's only 2 movies that have terrified me that I couldn't sleep at night after watching them, and one was The Exorcist and the other one was Jaws. For some reason, yes. Jaws just being here in South Florida, always being out in the water,
yes.
Always being out on the beach. I was terrified of going in the water after watching Jaws, and that kept me up at night as well. Well, this was a very interesting talk and a very interesting topic, and I know we have another good one coming up on the next episode. Who do we have?
Another sort of contemporary or modern mystic, Gemma Galgani, an Italian mystic, pretty close to us in time. So we've been hovering in the present for a while here. Padre Pio, this subject today, and then we'll stay closer to the present because we have received quite a number of emails from individuals who keep suggesting, why don't you do a podcast on so-and-so? And that so-and-so happens to be someone who's much more contemporary than some of the ancient or medieval people that we've been talking about. I think it's important to focus on the continuity and on the fact that Christian mysticism has not disappeared.
It's in the past, it's in the present, and it certainly will be in the future. Thank you, Carlos. And until the next time, thank you for listening to the Christian Mysticism Podcast. If you have any questions for Dr. Eyre, you'll find our email address in the show notes. Just send it over and we'll try to answer it in a future episode. And don't forget to click the subscribe button so you don't miss the next episode of the Christian Mysticism Podcast.